Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a little chat on the toxic personality cult of Sergiu Celibidache. Since I've been doing a bit of work with him lately, and I've been getting, reams of comments by his followers that have really been just over the top. And the ones that haven't been over the top are even sadder in some ways. And I want to talk about it. I really do, because it's an aspect of, life in the arts, life in the universe, life in the world, these cults of personalities that people build up. But in the arts, there's a particular kind of pointlessness to it all that I find really, really shocking. And it says more, of course, about the people who are members of the cult than it does about the artist in question. Now, Celibidache, as we all know, was a very, very strange personality. He started out life as a relative non-entity who fell into an amazing job for political reasons as a compromise choice to lead the Berlin Philharmonic during Fort Wengler's denazification hearings. And he was competent. He wasn't a terrible conductor. He wasn't a particularly distinctive conductor. He then went on to have a series of positions in Sweden and in Stuttgart and finally in Munich. And he became, as he got older, more and more interested in things like, Buddhism and Zen philosophy and all of these other non-musical and uninteresting things, to me. And I will point out, that doesn't mean these things, let me say this, aren't interesting. As far as they concern music, they don't interest me. And there were other conductors who did a lot of that stuff. Karajan was interested in Buddhism. He meditated. And Peter Maag, quit music for a whole length of time to go live in a monastery in Tibet or somewhere like that. And, and indulge his own feelings of spirituality. And all of that's fine. It's quite interesting that as far as music making goes, Karajan and Peter Maag did not come out of the process as perverse whack jobs like Celibidache did. Because what happened with Celibidache is that he began to conceive of music as a series of detached moments to be performed as slowly as humanly possible, so each of them could be absorbed in some finite length of time, which only he knew, and which some people did absorb, and most people fell asleep listening to him. And like every other conductor of the world who had a concept, sometimes it worked and sometimes it did not. And more often than not, it did not, at least on the recorded evidence. Now, he refused to make recordings, technically. He refused to make recordings because he believed that recordings were not music, that you could never replace the experience of being there live. I think that's total bullshit. I think that's ignorant nonsense. And I really believe that conductors who say that because they're not good at it and because they can't tolerate hearing the results of their own work and realizing just how lousy it usually was. It's the hit and miss conductors who really hate recordings. And I'm not arguing that recordings are a substitute for live performances. That's stupid. The argument against recordings is a stupid argument. Recordings are music. They are lovely music. They are adequate representations of music, but they are different representations. It's like saying a portrait of a person is not the person. Well, duh. It's not. It's not the real live thing. It's a representation. But it's a legitimate representation. It's an artistic representation. And when you're dealing with artists who appreciate that, who can get comfortable with that kind of representation, they make recordings. Now, if Celibidache was not comfortable making recordings, that's his privilege. And I have to say, the world is none the worse for the lack of Celibidache recordings. If they all vanished tomorrow, it would make no difference. No difference at all. And Celibidache might agree with that sentiment. His followers, however, oh my, quite a different thing. And the hypocrisy in the Celibidache cult of personality is especially appalling, because those who criticize me for claiming that a recording is a poor representation of the work in question should be, struck by lightning from the great Celibidache beyond, because this is exactly what he would say about it. And it really is. And the nature of the criticism I've been getting has been threefold, essentially. And each kind is a little more sort of flaky and irrelevant than the one before. But the first is the most obvious. The first is just vicious, vituperative, crazy screaming and ranting and raving. It's the most fun to read, also the most disturbing. I mentioned in a previous video about just this awful anti-Semitic rant this guy went off on because I didn't like Celibidache, some of Celibidache's recordings. This was, by the way, in response to my video about Celibidache's best recordings, where I was complimentary, and the guy still went off. But we all know historically that no one needs an excuse to blame the Jews if that's what they're going to do, and that's what the guy did. And I just deleted him forever, and that was that. I mean, you're always going to have crazies, but the fascinating thing about it, of course, is that kind of hysteria says far more about the person sending the message than it does about Celibidache. I mean, it wouldn't matter what they were fixated on. They could have been fixated on a head of lettuce for all it would have mattered. They needed something to validate their lives and their taste and their insecurities. And so they picked Celibidache. It's not his fault. It's his fault for setting up, a philosophy which is demonstrably and factually false in all of its particulars of what it says about music. And he invented these epiphenomena, and so that's one group, and they're the obvious crazies. The less obvious crazies are the ones who take his pseudo-philosophy rather seriously and talk about how he adapted his interpretation to the acoustics of the room and to this. Well, let's just talk about the acoustics of the room, shall we? Every conductor and every musician adapts their performance to the acoustics of the room because they adjust what they hear based on how it sounds in the room in which it's being played. One of the classic examples is the richness of sound that Ormandy cultivated, which many say was a response to the dryness of the acoustic in the Academy of Music in Philadelphia, where the orchestra often played. I mean, things like that happens all the time. Organ music, holy cow. You can't even make an organ recital. The tempo is determined by the amount of reverberation. If you're in a cathedral, you might have to play something at 1/3 the tempo that you could do it somewhere else, simply to avoid overlapping that would turn everything into sonic mud. But I do have a couple of observations about this. And the first is that the differences in acoustics in concert halls are not like the differences between concert halls and cathedrals. You're not talking about 7 seconds of reverberation versus a millisecond of reverberation. Concert halls are somewhat standardized to the extent that the variation is not going to be anything like Celibidache's decision to slow something down to 50% its normal tempo, which is what he normally did. I happen to know the acoustic of the room in which the Munich Philharmonic often played. It's not notably different from the acoustic of other places. And when you have an audience slurping up the reverberation, the need to make those adjustments, the grotesque adjustments that Celibidache makes, the ridiculous adjustments, is all is substantively less. Let's put it that way. And in one work in question, which I talked about, the Sibelius Fifth Symphony, where he just starts out at a normal tempo and then gets slower and slower and slower. Well, acoustics have nothing to do with it. He started at a normal tempo. I mean, the room did not slow down the performance. He slowed down and got slower and slower and slower. So that's one of the sort of intellectual, serious criticisms, which is just total hokum, absolutely ridiculous. So he adjusted his acoustics, his performance to the acoustics. Good for him. It also does not explain why, as I pointed out in the review, he became such a one-trick pony. In other words, he almost always did the same thing to everything, no matter what piece it was, no matter when it was written, no matter what style it was written in, no matter how many notes there were to a bar, no matter what you think someone might have done in order to clarify the texture. He didn't care. He smoothed out the dynamics. He eliminated connectivity between phrases. He eliminated so much of the contrast built into the piece and was entirely based on highlighting little tiny elements within the work. Now, some say that's not what he said. He was interested in counterpoints. Some say he was interested in the line. He was interested in colors. This is all verbal. He could say whatever he damn well pleases. And we've been there before. What matters is what he does. What matters is what he does sounds like. What matters is whether it suits the work that he's doing it to. And to play everything the same way, which is roughly incredibly slowly, with extreme attention to a few individual moments, and let everything else go to hell and ignore 50%, let's be generous, of what the composer indicated in terms of accent and phrasing and everything else. I mean, come on. Okay. So that's that issue. The intellectual critique. And I understand people wanting to follow an artist. There is an entire group of listeners, a huge group of listeners, a large one, who simply says everything is interesting because it's different from everything else. And the more it's different, the more interesting it must therefore be. And thus, the more legitimate it must therefore be. And that's an unarguable position. That is a question of taste. And everyone is entitled to their taste in that respect. They are. So you can't say, well, you're wrong. It is different. And if you value difference for its own sake, then you're going to love these performances. If you value music and the music in question, well, that's another matter. That's definitely another matter. And I need to stress something in this connection, which I think is really very important, which is what my job is as opposed to what a listener's job is. A lot of these people who write forget that as a critic, I have, especially a record critic, which is what we're talking about, I am a consumer advocate. My job is to say, okay, there are X recordings of work Y. And if you had to pick this one as opposed to all of those other versions of work Y, why would you? Why should you? Would your money be spent better elsewhere? That's the question I'm answering. I answer it in terms of evaluating these recordings comparatively to see whether one performance is better than another one, or one performance has certain qualities that might wear better if somebody makes the financial investment in the performance. That's the question I'm answering. It's not about, do I like it? That factors into my recommendation, but that's not the mission. That's not the assignment that I'm trying to fulfill. And my own personal taste matters, of course, my subjective impressions matter. But when I talk about these performances, I talk about facts. I talk about tempo and balance and accent of this version as compared to other versions. And these are not debatable. They're not debatable at all. They are what they are. And anybody who hears that performance is going to hear what I describe, because that's where my credibility lies. My credibility lies in saying that if this performance does this, if this trumpeter misses a note, if this conductor is very slow, that is objectively true. That's how a serious critic gets, a reputation. I may be wrong about millions of things, and people may disagree with me about performances endlessly, but I think I can pretty safely say, we all make mistakes, but generally speaking, the facts that I describe are true. And so that makes these people very uncomfortable. They really do, because all they can say in answer to the question that this performance is slower, less well played, does this and does that as compared to these other reference recordings, all they can say is, well, I like this and I hate those. Well, who cares? Who cares? No one cares what you like. No one cares what I like. What matters is how does this compare to the other, and should I buy it? Should I spend money on this? I mean, nowadays with streaming services and whatnot, you've already spent the money and you can sample and play around, and that's a great thing. That's a wonderful thing. But I can guarantee that Sibelius Fifth that I reviewed is just an awful performance and will never, ever become, the recommended Sibelius Fifth among anybody who cares about that work, given the competition, if they've really listened. And I suspect that many have not. They certainly have not listened to as many different performances as I have, only to hear Celibidache and be transfixed by the miraculous uniqueness of it all. I mean, sometimes that happens. It can, but chances of it happening are rather slender. Let's be honest, right? So that's number two. Those are the people who are the apologists. Let's call them. There's the wackos, the apologists, and then there's the most interesting group. These are the people who saw him live and rave about live performances. And I don't care what they have to say about live performances. It's totally irrelevant. Their feelings about live performances, all they talk about is their love of the man and what transformative experiences they were musically. Who gives a shit? So what? You were transformed. Good for you. I mean, I'm very happy that you were transformed, but it doesn't make any difference because we're not discussing those. We're not discussing your transformation. We're discussing the sound of a recording, which is available for sale. We're not talking about live performances. And these are the people who are in some ways the most interesting because they're criticizing my review of a bad performance of a recording by saying, well, live performances were wonderful. So maybe some of them were. I'm sure he gave many wonderful performances. Otherwise, he wouldn't have lasted as long as he did. Although, I mean, he was German. I mean, he was in Germany. He was Romanian, but he was in Germany, where if you have a concept, I mean, they'll put up with anything. He could have shown up naked and sprayed whipped cream on himself while he conducted the Eroica Symphony at 1/3 the normal tempo, and everyone would have thought it was just divine because it had a concept. So, there are the conceptual people there too who accept him for that reason. But the fact that he did things live, I saw him live. I saw him do pictures at an exhibition in Bruckner 4 live. I thought they were fabulous concerts. I really did. I really did. I think his Bruckner 4 is marvelous. It's ridiculously slow, but it's marvelous. And his pictures at an exhibition. And I thought that what he did was fascinating. I was delighted to hear it. And it translated to the recordings rather well, I might add. I mean, there's no reason that the concept doesn't come over other than the failure of the conductor to deliver the goods on the day. That's, recordings are good enough these days that they usually get the job done, unless the artists do not. And Celibidache was a not as often as not. And I don't know, maybe he would have agreed with that, maybe he wouldn't have. But that's how it sounds to me, and I have the evidence to back me up. The result of this, the he was wonderful live people, or the apologist people, or the crazy people, is, I think, one of the most toxic and unpleasant and anti-musical groups of individual artist fans that I have seen in a very long time. I mean, there are many artist cults. You know it. There's the Argerich cult, the Furtwängler cult, the Horenstein cult. Oh, God, talk about a waste of time. And, no matter who they are. And they all actually seem to be particularly popular in Britain as groups, because in Britain you have societies. Every composer has a society. I think it's wonderful, actually. It's wonderful that people get together to share a hobby. But, it's a uniquely English phenomenon. And so you tend to get, when societies sort of metastasize and turn malignant, you wind up with a personality cult. A composer cult's the Bruckner cult. Oh, my, of course. But these are, we know about them. Most of the time, they're pretty benign. They're just a bunch of fans or enthusiasts who get together to share a hobby and to find each other and pat each other on the back and tell each other how wonderful they are and how superior they are to the rest of humanity because, they've seen the light. I mean, it's not much different from a religion. I mean, that's what makes it a cult, right? It's a bunch of people telling each other that they possess absolute truth and everybody else is wrong and going to hell. And so, musical hell is the result of people who are not members of their musician personality cult. I do think that, at least compared to religion, musical cults are somewhat pathetic. I mean, religion deals with essential things that matter, right? Life, death, morality, the existence of an afterlife, whether we have a soul. I mean, things that you can really sink your teeth into in terms of major issues. Whereas musical cults are about entertainment. They're about, they're high art. Well, I don't care whether it's high art entertainment. They're about what you do in your leisure time. They're about whose Sibelius Fifth is better than someone else's Sibelius's Fifth. I mean, that is such a small and unimportant part of somebody's life. I mean, come on. No matter how much you may love Sibelius's Fifth, and I adore Sibelius, you all know that. And Sibelius's Fifth, I love this music. I love music. It's my life. It's my passion. I would be bereft if it didn't exist. I would not be bereft if Celibidache didn't exist, because we have so many other options. And the other point that I want to sort of conclude with is this. Celibidache is dead, first of all. And even when he was alive, he was a successful artist. He had his day in the sun. He's still having it because all of these unauthorized recordings are being issued, whether he wanted them to be or not. And the fact of the matter is that nothing I can say or do changes that. All I do when I talk about him is promote him. It's entirely positive, whether I like him or hate him. There's no such thing as bad publicity. He's getting his name out there. And, for his fans, they should appreciate the fact that he's generating controversy, which generates discussion. And all of that's a good thing. I freely admit that. I think he's a wonderful topic for me to talk about. I'm glad I can. I just don't think he's a wonderful topic to listen to most of the time in terms of his performances. But you'll decide for yourself, of course. Of course you will. And the ideal way, in my view, to listen to him is to sample, check out the recordings that I recommend, get a few of them, do it slowly. Many of you have commented that you like a specific recording and nothing else. That's the way to do it. It's to not decide that everything that the man has done has been, God's gift. It's to listen critically. And it's to keep your mind open to other interpretations and other ways of doing things. Because one of the saddest comments I got was from somebody that said, well, yes, this Sibelius Fifth was not the greatest that I've ever heard. It had some things, and the sound wasn't wonderful, but it's still a million miles better than any other version that ever existed. And this was one of the apologists. This was not one of the crazy vituperative screaming people. And that is so sad. All I could think was, boy, are you missing out. You are missing out on so much great music making. You're missing out on understanding the variety of expression that's built into this work, on hearing its many facets, on thinking that just this one version is superior to all others as a matter of course, because this one guy played it at half tempo. Oh, that's so pathetic. That's the antithesis of everything that I stand for, and that I think most of you who listen to me stand for. We're here to celebrate variety, infinite variety and infinite diversity, as they would say on the planet Vulcan, right? I mean, or something like that, infinite variety and infinite combinations. I don't know, whatever it was on Star Trek. One of you guys will tell me, I'm sure. But that's what this is all about. It's not about fixating on the one person as the bearer of truth. That is, if history teaches us anything, I'm just pontificating. It's that always leads down very, very dark pathways. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Watch out for those personality cults. You're smarter than that. You're more open-minded than that. You're more interesting personally than that. And there's so much more music than that. Take care.